So, let's talk about Cernunnos. More precisely, let's talk about the symbology of Cernunnos. What does it mean? So, let's start off with the etymology of the name, or the origin of the name, and the pronunciation of the name. So it seems that the name Cernunnos has its origins in the Proto-Indo-European word carnon, which means horn. So I suppose technically it should be pronounced Cernunnos, but I guess most people today pronounce it as Cernunnos, and so that's what we'll go with today in this talk. The earliest evidence that we have for Cernunnos dates back to the 4th century BCE, and it was found on a rock carving in the Camonica Valley in northern Italy. Now that carving showed an antlered figure wearing a long robe and wearing 2 torques, one on each arm. Now the 4th century BCE, that's very important, as this is way before any of the influence of the Romans over the Celtic people. So you may say then that this is the only god that we have whose image is truly Celtic and uninfluenced by the Romans. The most famous image that we have, though, is the image that we find on the Gundestrup cauldron. And the Gundestrup cauldron, that in itself dates back to the 2nd century BCE. And we should also note that the Gundestrup cauldron was found in Denmark. So this is not a local god. This god is widespread throughout the Celtic culture, from all the way down in Italy right up to Denmark. So with all these rock carvings and images scattered around right throughout Gaul and even right up into Britain, how do we identify them as being images of Cernunnos? So we find Cernunnos usually depicted with antlers. He usually has 1 or more torques. There's usually a serpent in the picture, and he's often accompanied by animals. So let's take a closer look at this symbology. So the antlers, and sometimes he even has stag's ears. And this tells us that the god is perceived as being a god that is a bridge between man and the animal realm. And the fact that Cernunnos is often accompanied by other mainly woodland animals reinforces the symbology and tells us he was lord of the beasts and a god of the woodlands and nature. Now the torques that he always seems to be either holding or wearing are a symbol of authority. Now a torque was only allowed to be worn by those Celts that were in authority, such as a king or a queen. So this tells us that he was seen by the Celts as a god that had authority. And it's interesting to see him in later depictions where he's accompanied or flanked either side by Apollo and Mercury, which would suggest to me that the Celts saw him as a more important figure than either of these two Roman gods. But there's also symbolism to tell us that he was a Chthonic god, that is, a god of the underworld and a god of life, death, and regeneration. And this is portrayed by the serpents that he's so often seen with. And why are the serpents related to the underworld and regeneration? Well, that's because, you see, serpents tend to live in holes in the ground. And so this then is linked to the underworld. But the serpent is also linked to regeneration. Through the serpent shedding its skin, it's as if the serpent has died and has again been reborn. But it's also interesting to note that usually the serpents depicted, usually but not always, the serpents are serpents that have a ram's head. And the ram is a symbol of fertility. And in fact, the antlers that Cernunnos wears is also a symbol of fertility. And fertility, of course, is associated with regeneration. So let's just go over this then. What did Cernunnos represent? The truth is, he represented the entire core of Celtic beliefs. He was a god of nature, he was a god of life, death and rebirth, he was a god of prosperity and fertility, and he was lord of the underworld. Perhaps the god that Caesar mentioned was the ancestor of the Celts, the god he equated to Despater, the god that takes the souls to the underworld and through his powers of regeneration prepares them for rebirth. So, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. And with that, I'll see you again on the next one.